Westward expansion, the Louisiana Purchase, and the Homestead Act. If you've made your way through the American school system, chances are you've encountered at least one of these historical markers of America's terrain. Because the United States is a country often defined by its public lands, lands that occupy a large amount of our country, but can be difficult to define, have muddied and complicated pasts, and uncertain futures. Some of America's 650 million acres of land allow for the outdoor recreational activities that many Americans love. But much of this public land is defined broadly and is overseen by a number of different departments. Understanding the makeup of our public lands, then, is important to comprehending how we treat our treasured landscapes. So today, let's parse out exactly what the United States' public lands are and how they've grown into a battleground between federal and states' rights. Federally owned lands come from a variety of past land purchases, broken treaties, colonization, and state cessions. With the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862, much of this federally owned land was transferred into the hands of private citizens in order to drive development in the Western territories. As a result, Eastern and Midwestern land was claimed by private interests like ranchers and miners. Homesteading was much harder in the West, however, due to its poor soil conditions and rocky terrain. So much of the public lands in the West and Alaska are still managed by government agencies. But this land is not patrolled by government agents stopping everyone from stepping onto its borders. In fact, most of it is accessible to hikers, bikers, miners, loggers, and oilmen. This is where America's public lands get confusing: its classifications. There are 5 agencies that oversee public lands in the United States: the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the Department of Defense. Each have their own niche, but all work in tandem to manage the vast federal lands throughout the country. For example, the National Park Service almost exclusively deals with 417 quote-unquote units consisting of national monuments, battlegrounds like Gettysburg, and parks like Yellowstone. But the vast majority of lands are overseen by the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM for short, and the Forest Service. The two deal with a complicated balance of multiple usage. Or, as the Congressional Research Service puts it in their overview of the United States' federal lands agencies, BLM management responsibilities are similar to those of the Forest Service. Sustain yields of multiple uses, including recreation, grazing, timber, watershed, wildlife and fish habitat, and conservation. In essence, their job is to manage public lands in such a way that a hiker and a logger might use the landscape for generations to come. As a result of this seemingly conflicting mission statement, these agencies are criticized constantly for either too much or too little management. We can see this dissension at play across modern history in cases like the Sagebrush Rebellion. The first iteration of this so-called rebellion began in the late 1970s as a reaction to the 1976 Federal Land Policy Management Act, which High Country News notes shifted the BLM's mandate from one of maximizing extraction to one that attempts to preserve public lands to some extent. Combined with previous legislation like the Wilderness Act in 1964, which allowed Congress to portion off wilderness areas in public lands, federal land management started to lean more towards preservation. So those who made their living on the resources of public lands felt as if they had been fouled by an overbearing landlord. Political groups and local communities reacted accordingly. They sought to gain more control of public lands by seeking to transfer management to the state and local levels. However, this would eventually lead to many states selling off land to private interests in order to balance their budgets. Although the rebellion eventually diffused with the election of Ronald Reagan, who associated strongly with the rebellion mentality, the battle over federal versus local management continues to simmer. Most recently, it exploded into an armed takeover of a wildlife refuge in Oregon by Ammon Bundy and his brothers, who sought to protest what they saw as a federal overreach on BLM-managed ranching lands.
Well, the people need to be in control of their own land.
Clearly, public land management is a complex issue tied up in not only the best practices of land conservation, but also in livelihoods and larger historical battles over federal regulation. With Trump in the White House, the issue of federally controlled lands now leans towards a lighter regulatory stance that favors extraction industries seeking more resources to fuel their businesses. We can see this most clearly in the controversy surrounding Bears Ears National Monument. The 1.35 million acre area of land was originally proposed by a coalition of 5 Native American nations in order to protect their historical and cultural landscapes. In December of 2016, Obama used the 1906 Antiquities Act to proclaim Bears Ears a national monument. This would bar new mineral extraction and be overseen by a commission consisting of 1 elected official from each of the 5 Native American nations. However, most recently, Trump shrunk the borders of the national monument by 85% in order to open land up for oil interests and extraction. And in this way, the Trump administration revealed its clear business-heavy stance towards public lands. As long as public lands exist in the United States, there will always be a struggle between federal oversight and private concerns. This is merely a reflection of the varied interests of those that use America's public lands. America's landscapes are steeped in layered meanings that make up a complicated balance of use and management. And it's here that the federal government attempts the ever-difficult task of creating and shaping a landscape rooted in culture, business, and identity. This one ended up being a lot longer than most of my videos just because I felt like it needed a little more room to breathe. So thanks for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon. You can chip in $1 or $2 or $3 for every video I make, and it really helps me out. Otherwise, I will see you next time.